Good morning. We're ready, or we think we're ready to go. We're just waiting for our first presenter. And I want to know whether or not Jeremy from Vuntut, Gwitchin government would be online, and can he confirm that the VGFN is ready to go?
Hello, can you hear us?
I can.
Wonderful. So it looks like we're then, we've got video here. Can you see us?
I can see you, yes. And Mr. Najutli too.
Wonderful. Yeah. Okay. And we're ready to go.
Okay, well then let's, thank you. Just as a bit of an introduction before we get started. First of all, thank everybody who's joining us this morning. Whatever weather people are facing, we're all here in our seats, and that's at least in Whitehorse. We have completed 2 productive days, and so I thank everyone for their contributions to date. And we're heading into the final stretch now, and we have 2 presentations this morning, starting with the Vuntut Gwitchin government and then Liard First Nation. Following that, we'll have closing remarks, and we're proposing that they be presented in the order that the initial presentation was made. So it's all on the draft agenda, and I'm sure we can move things along smartly as we proceed. And then after the closing remarks, I will provide some closing remarks and some commentary on next steps, and we'll consider it a job well done. Not to jinx us here, knock on wood. Hopefully all the technology works in our favor. So with that, I would turn it over to the Vuntut Gwitchin government to take it away. So please proceed.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. I'm here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy Brammer, Fish and Wildlife Manager, Vuntut Gwitchin government. Yes, almost nice to do a presentation. I've done a number of boards and committees, but at this point, speaking on behalf of First Nation as a resource person, and looking at what was said yesterday and what probably what the future will be. Mainly speaking of wetlands and a little bit about myself. I like a little bit of gold, I like a little bit of salmon, and I like a little bit of Hwëch'in. That makes me a Yukon, and I hope you can all say the same for yourself. So, and right now with just speaking openly, directly, with a Placer Mining Act, I think you can start mining in British Columbia, and you can finish in the Arctic Ocean. That's legislation at this point. We don't want that. That has to change. Nevertheless, with our traditional territory there, Hwëch'in traditional territory, I think for many years before the land claim settlement, the elders were quite concerned about their traditional territory in terms of the ecosystem and what it means. And I think their interest was protecting the watershed right from the headwaters and the mountains, and to see the watershed and the water right out to the ocean. That's what they wanted. So, in that sense, I think that's the probably the most naturalistic view in the world to have, that they, at some point in time, through their language and their culture and speaking my language, understanding it. So, look at the watershed. So we follow suit in terms of protecting some of the areas in the traditional territory, watershed, Klondike River Basin, and beyond that we needed to, but we did what we can at this point. We looked at Crow Flats. We got a whole watershed of Crow Flats. There's 2,000 lakes there, shallow lakes. There, some point in time in their history, there was 250,000 like waterfowl that spent their years in that area, but there isn't that population anymore, and some species are not there anymore. And lakes and the water level in the lakes are going down. big question is how does that happen? A lot of vegetation growth or more frost melting, it's a combination, accumulation of many things for the cold area, I think. So I came with effects in terms of what's happening out there. Right now, the moose population is, I would say, healthy in that area. And speaking of wetlands and protecting wetlands, they're and speaking of tucks, at this point, my phone's ringing. The habitat changes, you know, like for example, a lot of the moose are on the going on the north slope side on the height of the land. The watershed going north into the Bering Sea, and the watershed flowing south into the Coal River Basin. So in the watershed flowing north, the moose are going up there and making that their probably we can't confirm that, but they're probably making their annual habitat from the yearly basis. Because they don't have to eat there. They can just like walk and browse because the willows are getting taller, and they can feed off the willows in that area. Whereas they never used to have that food source available to them. So now they're having that, so they're moving up north. So that's been going on. Where there used to be whale bones, there are now moose bones. Put it that way. So they're moving north. So they're probably migrating north into their new habitat. So they're also migrating moose from Coquitlam to Hwëch'in and Hwëch'in River in Alaska. The moose population migrated back and forth. But that population moose is going down. The numbers are going down due to hunting, predation, and everything else on lots of stuff, and predation on both sides. Speaking of that, the wildlife and the habitat itself, but as far as that's the coastline area. So getting into the other areas that we also wanted to protect the headwaters of the Klondike Fishing Branch River, and that's back in before we're going to start a land use settlement. That's where we got an education for elders as to what areas we should protect. So the information and the positions came from the elders on that, and then we took it forward and we protected the area. So we've done that, and we did the best we could protecting the whole watershed from the height of land and Klondike Fishing Branch River. And there's chum salmon spawning in there, and other species of freshwater fish that coming out there. There's a lot of wildlife in that area, and we like to continue with that wildlife, you know. So in the watershed that area, but I think what's happening at this point, there's a lack of research in terms of basically what's in the river system. And we also have Klondike, the whitefish wetlands. We've got that area protected. So we've gone to the extent that we could to protect areas in our official territory, and for the sake of wildlife, for the sake of the wetlands, and all the other ecosystems in that area. Probably our goal in the future would be to look at ecotourism. Would be an opportunity. And if you don't look at a pristine area, I would say the Hwëch'in River is a pristine area and affected by climate change and other effects. So you can look at other effects on this area to say, well, this is a pristine area, and this is what happens when there's outside effects on this area. So that would make it up in terms of category of pristine. On this planet, I don't know, but nevertheless, that's ideal. That would be idealistic to look at. So, how does legislation and everything affect the whole watershed and the navigable water? The river, the Coal River and the Hwëch'in River are navigable waters, and they're not under a land use settlement. They're just basically no man's land. Everyone uses the water system. But the lakes on the settlement land are they're under the agreement, and everything that's on the settlement land. So other than the areas protected watershed protecting like the chief will inject the whole system of wetlands because they're wetlands protected under to make it under that basically establishing it as protected area. Now, what does all this mean? If there's plots of land that are crown land within our traditional territory, let's just say at some point in time there's placer mining, how would that affect the navigable water? And how would that affect the wetlands? How does that really like protecting wetlands so we can't have other legislation that would protect them? What is the socio-economic benefit and impact? Environmental impact, the economic impact, the social impact to those areas. Consideration for the future, how do we evaluate that? At this point, those are, that's a broad term, and there's no definition for that at this point, or no one has defined it. We can look at defining that for traditional territory, and it'd be a rolling definition, probably for now and into the future as the agenda change for First Nation. At this point, we like to keep it as probably like keep the river as it is for now. We have no, I haven't done any analysis on the river to the extent they say that the upstream user has an effect on the downstream user. But there's industrial drilling on the upstream of Hwëch'in River. It's happened to be located on the river system, 60 miles, 100 kilometers from the west border. So, in a practical sense, other than the legislation itself, how would an upstream industrial development affect downstream user who would be the community local or reserve? How would that affect us? We wouldn't know that at this point because in water system, we're about the water because we never had a history, a long history of analysis of what's in the property, what properties are in the water system in terms of like cadmium, arsenic, and other minerals that are in the water. And let's say, for example, there's an upstream user, there's some mining, and let's just say they got to spawn produce metals or any kind of metals at all. They got to be settled in the southern front. And they would affect a downstream, hypothetically, at this point that we would know. So we need probably to do some research in that area and do a database collection of the river system in terms of what's in there. So we could have probably a healthy river, and that would be like a good pilot project for Yukon. For example, we don't know what's going on in Yukon River and the effects from mining in that area and placer mine. If they're, let's just say a placer mine at this point, which they move 30 foot of overburden to get down into the coarse rock to do some placer mining, then what is in that 30 foot of overburden and where does that go? Where does that go? They monitor with a water monitor and flush it right into the creek, and that goes downstream. And how does that affect the whole water system? What's in that 30 foot overburden at this point? So when it comes to placer mining, I placer mine for one whole season, so I get a good idea on what that's about. So any individual can say, I don't know what I'm talking about because I know what I'm talking about, and that's it. And I've been involved in line from settlement and part of that, and I got a clear understanding as to what that 28 chapters have to say for itself. So I think that the effect of that is like should there be changes in terms of like how the wetlands or water system get affected by mining and what changes should be made. And not not going to faculty be an environmentalist, but to say, well, how do you continue mining? How do you still protect watershed? You can do both at the same time. It's probably a little more complex than to do, but it is more complex right now with lack of any teeth and then legislation with the Pennsylvania. So definitely need some teeth in there. Question is, how do you keep mom and pop operation going and still have a healthy river system? At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. How do you do the socio-economic environmental impacts of the river system or watershed system or a creek and say that that's viable or not viable? For example, you take Black Hills and Creek, I call it Black Creek, that flow from Black Hills down into Stewart River. 1995, that was that pristine creek, and the old wilderness was there in that creek system. It's not there anymore. It's a tailings pond right from start to finish. So right from the back end to the front end. So if you look at that area, and then the socio-environmental economic impact of that river system, that little river system there, it's one big like mining, right? And that's back in like 1997 to 2000. So how many years did that take to have it from wall to wall to the hill, like having tailings pond all the way down to the mountain? Now, screw that the miners that went in there and look at that, they mined for a placer mine. One of them went and started cutting firewood for sale afterwards, and he didn't make any money at doing that. But look at that big tailings pond. What does that really say? You know, we're talking about bureaucracy, you're talking about legislation, you're talking about tax, you're talking about security, you're talking about how to make effective mining and that kind of stuff. But if you look at the lay of the land, whether that's done, and what's doing the ecosystem, what's doing the Yukon. That's and what can we do about it in that sense, you know? We live here in Yukon, and we're probably going to be here for a while. So, and that's and what do we want to look at? What do we want the Yukon to look like? You know, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. I think maybe possibly, what can you do with a big sandbox? All the water, the headwater from the watershed of from the dome, you saw the dome, all watershed is coming out of there, and all rivers is watershed. And what can you do with that sandbox? And the other pristine watersheds, some of the watersheds that are flowing out, and the possibility of the effects of mining in this area. So, and if you look at Yukon and how many mines that are being monitored right now for their tailings, and what was the benefit of all that, and where is the economic benefit of Yukon? I think that's basically how do we keep the economy going for placer mining, but still have it done in a viable way. For the end of the day, we still have a system water ecosystem, keep it intact, and do the mining at the same time. There's like stuff up like going up Bunker, also Bunker Creek. So, and there's other like placer mines that are, if you look at it before, after 1992, what are how much overburden? As the mining carries on, the placer mining in some of these areas, and just an example, and vectors, there's all the areas of the mine that are mineable, but now they're going to move more and more overburden to get to the basically the ability to get to the goal. So and what happens with all that overburden, and how does it get pushed into the whole system, water system? And I think that has to change. So protecting wetlands is important, but also enhancing wetlands is there's migrating birds, there's freshwater fish, a variety of them, and plus the other areas that are salmon spawning areas. So we talked to the history from the Klondike people and the headwaters of Klondike River, and how much salmon, what's the population of salmon species that used to spawn up in that area, and the devastation of the spawning areas. So, they're to turn that around, like no one has ever, like, there is no real interest by government to basically look at restoring that area to a point where there's valuable salmon spawning up there, and that's not happening at this point. So what do we change? What is the definition of that? Looking at what the impacts would be in that area, and the benefits and the negative impacts. So I think we look at nutrition care for one type. I think we'd like to keep it the way it is right now in terms of until we can do some more research in this area. So I think we're fortunate, but we took advantage of the political climate that we can get some of the areas protected and the watershed protected, and some of the wetlands protected and whole river system. So we've done that, and well, thanks to the people that have worked at this, and just working on it, and pushing and getting some of the areas protected, and some of the people that are there were involved in doing this. So especially the fishing barracudas. And that's really a unique area out there. And that's probably like, yes or no, but I think we possibly, like for Yukon, legislative change in terms of some of the acts that come, acts that are really passing on that, the acts that affect the water system, the headwaters for freshwater fish, salmon. So, and the habitat. Anyway, that's and that involves takes time, takes money, and people with expertise. And the fact that we could cooperate and work together on this is the main thing. If you can have 6 people in a room agreeing to a plan, then you got something. But there's always going to be compromises got to be made. But change got to be made at the same time. There's got to be changes. And there's got to be a new plan, and not everyone's going to agree with it, but it has to happen. That's my experience in history of involved in plans and basically involved in deliberations. So, and we look like that, and you get. So thank you very much. Any questions or any comments from anyone out there?
Yeah, we'll open the floor to questions, and we have Councillor Esau Schaefer here contribute to answering questions as well about any of the subjects discussed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Brammer and Mr. Njutli. Are there any questions from the board? I wonder if I have a quick question. I wonder if you could comment on the your sense of the state of mapping and the quality of information that you have about the wetlands in the Vuntut traditional territory. Do you have any thoughts about that? Is there a lot of work to be done? Do you feel confident that you understand where the wetlands are, what the quality of the wetlands are, where the what activity is taking place?
Yes, me.
Yeah, I think that's, that information is definitely accessible to the public through all electronic system or through basically speaking about it and how we got there, the history. So we can do both. Like, there's the area, the Crow Flat, there's North Yukon Park, which is a federal park. The north half of Crow Flat and the south half of Crow Flat is Sylvan land, but they're managed in conjunction under the same principles and philosophies of the park. So there's consistency there, and then also with the Chile Jig, which is on the Eagle Bell River area, and that's Chile Jig. So that's the whitefish wetlands. Also the Fishing Branch River, and that's the south part of our traditional territory, and that's Nitty Jig. So we have that area. I think there's that information is available. Yeah.
Thank you.
An interesting part about the Nitty Jig is that the whole watershed is protected from the height of land around the Nitty Jig.
Thank you. Mr. Warnsby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Najutli, for the presentation from Vuntut Gwitchin. I would like to ask one quick question I had, because I think Mr. Najutli made a comment that kind of cuts to the heart of a lot of what I think the water board is going to struggle with. How do we protect the river and keep without putting too much pressure on mom and pop? And I'm just wondering if Vuntut Gwitchin from that has any idea of what we can do in terms of additional information that may be needed with projects, or in terms of reclamation that can help balance those two very important objectives. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think what we've done, as an example, is to look at that one creek system and from that traditional territories that they in the Black Hill Creek, like how they mined that area out, and we didn't exact that legislation allowed that. So we didn't really want that for traditional territories. So we wanted to look at how we can protect some of these areas, and so we've done that with Fishing Branch River, and because there was no other legislation that would allow us to protect that whole area, to say that to keep it in a state its pristineness and to keep the ecosystem intact without protecting the whole area and having a tougher legislation than the Placer Mining Act itself. And that's what we had to do. Not opposing anything, but the goal was to protect that area. In a sense, how do you basically, if you look at it as a pilot project, if you look at that Black Creek, how it went out, and if you look at that area to assess that and do a pilot project to see what the benefits were and what the lack of, what are the negative impacts of that area was, and environmental impact versus what the socioeconomic benefit was of that whole area, to who and to what entity and to what an individual under basically the capitalistic view of Canada. And how does that change? Like you're impacting probably the private sector in a sense, so it gets complicated in that manner. So in a sense, how do you still protect that ecosystem and have mom and pop operate? The point is that it takes time and money. How would you know? How would you ever know that there was gold on there and there was no gold there at all to sustain itself and make it sustainable? So that's a complicated one. But we never solved that issue, or we never say, the Yukon hasn't said, well, let's just wait until we solve some of these issues. It's just like we've got our blindfold on and going forward with the 1898 Placer Mining Act, which is just mine, it was for that area. Whereas in today's world, there's much bigger equipment to move dirt a lot faster and extract a lot more and expand a lot more geographically on the surface of the bedrock and extract as much gravel and move it to the side and then extract the gold. So how do we like see that benefit? I know when there's some hard rock mining, there's a lot of drilling, a lot of analysis to go through to see that it's viable to do that. And if it's not viable, they won't do it. So it has to be viable to get investors to come in and hard rock mining to basically to invest in mining. The profit has to be there. And the other part about that is when you basically hear a presentation from a geologist that's in hard rock mining and mining how to extract the gold and how you can basically view all that's been assessed in terms of drilling in that area. There's some real extreme calculation as to how they can extract some of the minerals from that area and make a profit. But and they're very intelligent in that sense. But when it comes to the other side, to look at what what's going to be in the tailings pond in terms of the fallout from that, they don't seem to know very much. You know, all of a sudden they don't know much at all. So basically, what's up with that? Okay, you're feeling extremely intelligent in one area because there's a profit. Then on the other hand, like you look at the fallout of it, you know, and tailings pond, then all of a sudden, like you're unintelligent. So that basically that's kind of like some sarcasm there in terms of some humor, but that's what it is. Is it basically in some sense it's devastating, but it's. Look at the people that are doing it, and geologists, it's kind of laughable. But the question is, when you look at the assessment of what's going to be in the tailings pond after hard rock mining, what's going to be there, and how does the board get involved with it, and what goes into the river system after that, because the water will stop flowing. And it's based on hypothesis as to what's going to flow out of that tailings pond into the water system afterwards. Really don't know. No one actually, you know, basically tests for what's really in there. You can test for some certain things. Get a jug of water and test it. But there's always legislatively find a way around that to do that. If you look at there's not very much said about what's going on in Port McMurray. With the oil sands and what they put into the river system. If you go where the water flows through the Athabasca Lake from Port McMurray and the river that flows through that lake, you can see where the water flows and where the lake water is. There's a difference in color, very different in color. So, but there's no policy or regulation to define what's in the no man's land of that water. What's over here? What's coming out of the tailings pond from the extraction of tar sands, and what's over here and naturally in the lake system. So there's no policy or regulations to define both, and that's something that we probably need to do in the Yukon. Yeah, so that might mean like, you know, getting still, hard rock mine can still make money, but they profit, but they might make less profit if there was a little more, basically a little more stringent environmental guidelines for the Yukon. So that's what I would, for the water staff and for the plastic mining and probably, hard rock mining. So anyway, that's my thoughts. So anybody else have any more questions or want to have a discussion on this? Like that and
Thank you, Mr. Julie. That was much appreciated. Are there any other questions in the? No, well, thank you very much. We appreciate your presentation today. It is helpful in understanding the perspective of the Vuntut, and that allows us to get a fuller picture from a broader audience. So thank you very much. This then brings us, we're a little ahead of schedule, but if Liard First Nation is ready to proceed, we can proceed to their presentation.
Hi there, Mr. Chair. I'm waiting for Travis Stewart to join us. Oh, I think he might be there under Drew Milden.
Hey, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I'd like to thank the chair and the members of the board for having us here and initiating this important discussion. Elephant appreciates that the board is charged with the most important of tasks, safeguarding our waters. It is with that I'll hand it over to our legal counsel to take it from here.
I'd like to acknowledge the chair and the members of the board. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy, and that your families are as well in this difficult time. I'm attending today from Victoria, BC, and I'd like to acknowledge the unceded lands of the Lekwungen people of the Esquimalt and Songhees, where I do my living and working, and to the people whose traditional territories are in Whitehorse, where the hearings are being held. Hwëch'in, thank you for having me, and I want to thank LFN's Chief and Counsel for asking me to appear on their behalf here. I think a really big question the board might have is, why is LFN here? And I think others in the room and online might have the same question. There isn't any placer mining going on in Casca territory that we're aware of, but we think that one of the first placer mines in the territory may have actually been on a creek tributary to the Liard River. As well, Frank Watson, over who the town of Watson Lake was named, bar mined successfully on Watson Bar just downstream of Upper Liard. So no one knows what the future may hold, and placer miners may someday wish to return to Casca territory. Wetland placer mining is a grave concern for LFN for this reason. It's uniquely destructive to wetlands and all forms of life that rely on wetlands, and the Casca Aboriginal rights that rely on those things for their sustainable exercise. I would point out that I'm not an expert in the Placer Mining Act. I have way more experience with the Quartz Mining Act, but my understanding from the reading I've done is really from the earliest stages of a placer being brought into play, rights start to accrue to those people, to placer miners, and those rights, that's an impact on title, right? That is title to First Nations title being impacted, because ultimately that's an alienation of those lands to another party. And so while we're here, we'll primarily talk today about the rights that are impacted, moose in wetlands, for example, the right to hunt moose in wetlands, and all the things fall from that, right? Generational education, all the other opportunities that happen on a hunting trip. There's also this issue of title that ultimately gets alienated as well through placer mining. So this whole, the presentation we're going to make today is about the ways in which Casca rights and Casca title is through the lens of Casca rights and title. I think that's, very clear to the board and everyone attending that things are a bit different in Casca territory, as one of the 3 First Nations in the Yukon who are not in final agreements. I think the reality is that leaves legislative holes. A good example of that is how, YESA a few years ago was amended to add in First Nations without final agreements as something whose interest might be considered in an assessment. But, there remain sort of significant holes in the legislative and regulatory policy around the territory with respect to those who are not in final agreements. There's no Renewable Resource Council in the southeast. That has an impact. That plugs in, the lack of that body, and it's plugging into land use planning and other decision making throughout the territory means there's a pretty significant hole here. So the Casca, I'm not sure how widely it's known, but the Casca filed a claim to Aboriginal rights and title for the entirety of their territory. So they filed a legal action back in 2010. And that remains with the court, and it's in abeyance for now. But it should be. There's no doubt that there is an assertion of rights and title to the entirety of that territory that is in place. The Casca never ceded, surrendered, or extinguished their Aboriginal title or their associated rights, and that means rights to make decisions about the land, rights to the natural resources of the land, and to carry out the traditional practices that continue to this day. And so finding ways to reconcile the Crown's and the public's interests around constitutionally protected rights is going to require political and policy renewal. It's going to require approaches to consultation and an independent tribunal's responsibilities for consultation or Crown responsibilities for consultation. It's going to require creative efforts, I think, on everyone's part to find ways to do that well. And so placer mining and wetlands collides with fundamental aspects of the Casca worldview, and it heightens LFN's elevated concern for the changes occurring across Yukon landscapes due to climate warming and loss of lands to development, both large and small. So in terms of now responding to the questions from the board, the first question, what information should be required to support a water license application related to placer mining activities in wetland area? You probably all got these memorized by now. So I want to make a point from the Hwëch'in rights and title case. It's often thought about in terms of the title decision that came down, right? There was the first title declaration in Canada's history, and it was to a broad stretch of the territory, right? So despite the Crown for many years arguing that Aboriginal title might be these tiny little parcels, the outcome was there's a broad swath of British Columbia that has now been picked out of the jurisdiction of the province and handed back to the Hwëch'in, whose lands they were. I think that has had really interesting effects on the way treaties are interpreted in the court, both historic treaties and modern treaties like the final agreements, is that judges are now, when they're interpreting those treaties, you'll see mention all the time of the trade-off, right? Something was happened. Aboriginal rights and title were traded for final agreement rights and all of the aspects of final agreements. And I think prior to Hwëch'in, the Crown and judges did not know what that was traded, right? It was some kind of, at least to the white Western legal system, it was some kind of, inchoate broad thing, right? Rights and title. We now know that it's a broad claim to territory, and it's an actual property right that comes with a lot of power and jurisdiction. And so when courts are considering treaty interpretation, they're now saying, yeah, like something really important was traded here, and we really need to up the game in recognizing those modern treaty rights and historic treaty rights in ways that honor that exchange that happened. So people often think about it, the Hwëch'in case as being a title case, but it was also a rights case. And they actually won 100% of a right to hunt and trap to a moderate livelihood to 100% of the traditional territory that was being claimed, right? So the title case won about 50%. The rights case was 100%. And in that case, which was primarily about forestry in that case, the judge essentially found that the entire forestry regime in British Columbia was ultra vires the Constitution. It had no force and effect. And the reason was it prioritized commercial timber harvesting over everything else. It did not provide for the sustainability of the Hwëch'in exercises of their Aboriginal right to hunt and trap for a moderate livelihood. And the problem, the judge said, is so that's a case, right, where there's not an asserted claim to rights and title. The nation fought it through, proved the right, proved in court that they had the right. But once having done that, the court said, look, the province can't issue forest licenses in this territory, in the rights area, because they don't know what the rights needs are. They don't have a database that says, here's what the Chilcotin team need in order to exercise their rights. Here's what the Chilcotin team rights are. And they didn't have a database that demonstrated that they knew what the abundance and diversity of species that were necessary to make that right meaningful was, right? So there's a huge information hole with respect to Crown responsibilities. When a Crown wants to legislate and make decisions about traditional territories of a First Nation outside of a treaty, you got to have the information that is necessary. And I think that's really important because it goes to the heart of this question, right? What information should be required to support a water license? Well, you need to know what the rights are that are exercised in the area, right? You need strong evidence that the wetland place or development will not compromise ecosystem function, that the exercises of Casca rights associated with wetland use will remain meaningful over time. You need to identify and analyze the adverse impacts on Casca rights that requires consideration of ecosystem effects and impacts on specific species. It doesn't end there, right? Casca rights can't be described accurately without the involvement and direction of the Casca themselves. Travis Stewart, the lands director over at LFN, will talk a little bit more about how LFN does that later. So territorial decision makers shouldn't approve a license until proponents provide several years of comprehensive baseline information that includes the species present in the area, the frequency and timing of use of the area, the quality of water before disturbance, cumulative impacts from all regional developments, the nature, quality, volume, and variability of the water at risk, and the results of the analysis, the effects of Crown decision on LFN's abilities to ensure their exercises of Casca rights. Basically, we're saying decision makers need reliable information about the ecological thresholds of the watershed, and it really needs to be informed by the Casca perspective on those things. And I think, that's too often where decision makers fall down, right? The courts have been very, very specific about saying you need to take into account the Indigenous perspective on an infringement to understand how serious that's going to be. And there's too often a reliance on scientific evidence and not on traditional knowledge or the Indigenous perspective on what an impact might be. It might look like a small impact from a scientific perspective. It might be a very large impact from the perspective of those who have lived on those lands since time immemorial. Which just takes me to our second question. What should the wetland conservation development and utilization perspective be for a watershed, and how can they be balanced on an application by application basis? Just to go back to the issue of scientific evidence, just a quick story. The received scientific evidence on the coast has always been, with respect to forestry, you can do 20% equivalent clear-cut area before you start to impact salmon returns. So I was working with a scientist a while back on that issue, and I asked him to do something. He thought, well, we don't do that. Doesn't fit into how we do modeling of fisheries habitat. But they took it and they went and they looked at the total equivalent clear-cut area over time in that watershed, and they were able to look at historic fish counts and discovered that at a 17% equivalent clear-cut area, they had lost 50% of the pink salmon run in that watershed. And so for 30 years, the received scientific information was you can log in a watershed up to a 20% equivalent clear-cut area without an impact. And the reality is BC is now going up and down the coast, putting into play this modeling, right? What is it we can actually do to ensure salmon protections in the face of new information? So I just wanted to mention that because it really, I think it brings to the forefront how the ways in which the best scientific information that was known at the time can actually fail when planning objectives for a watershed. The objectives for wetland conservation within a watershed should be no net loss of ecosystem function. This means no immediate or long-term effects from development that may undermine the exercises of Casca rights now or in the future, including the enjoyment of Casca title. Development should only be permitted in wetlands when the risks to ecosystem health are well understood and the benefits of development clearly outweigh the risk. Land use zoning needs to be in place before wetland development is considered. As I mentioned earlier, this is a problem in the southeast Yukon. There's no initiatives underway to do any land use planning, no comprehensive regional land use plans that are grounded in Cascade Indigenous land use patterns and traditional knowledge. And so, the LFN's position is that there shouldn't be any developments authorized in a watershed or near wetlands at all until that kind of regional planning is undertaken and there's some understanding of the broad-based impacts. So it's very difficult to balance anything on an application by application basis without the credible baseline information and an understanding of the cumulative effects of all existing and proposed development within a watershed. And so, to go back to the Chilcotin impacts on rights issue is decision makers, independent tribunals or the Crown, are flying blind without having that information necessary, right? Which is information that includes both what are the impacts on rights and what are the things that are needed for those rights to be exercised, both in their meaningful way and in a way in which the First Nation prefers to exercise them. So I'll move on to question number 3. LFN's position is that reclamation must restore ecosystem functions to a condition that supports the ongoing and meaningful exercises of Casca rights. Those methods should be accepted only where the evidence proves their efficacy and where authorizations provide for ongoing monitoring of reclamation results, including that Casca rights will remain meaningful post-decision. Reclamation should include the restoration of pre-development water discharge and flow patterns, nutrient composition, chemistry, and benthic communities. I'm hoping the board's not going to ask me what a benthic community is. Reclamation must create conditions for the successful regrowth of native species where reducing that risk that invasive species will proliferate, and reclamation alone is not enough. No amount of human ingenuity can replace wetlands that take thousands of years to form naturally, so we should be avoiding damaging those fragile ecosystems in the first place. As the board is aware, and there are 5 failed mines going through reclamation and closure in Casca traditional territory. So they're deeply alive to the failures of, at least in the quartz mining realm, the regulatory processes, particularly pointed out by Justice Duncan in the recent Wolverine bankruptcy hearing. The fact that taxpayers are paying for billions, at least $2 billion worth of cleanup in the next few years in Casca territory alone is something that should give everyone pause when considering, what is development, what does sustainable development look like, both in an Aboriginal rights and title realm, the Indigenous perspective on their land use and impacts on their lands, but nuts and bolts financially, who's going to pay at the end of the day for the cleanup. So that's the answer to those questions. I want to go just briefly to the duties of the board with respect to common law, Aboriginal rights and title in the context of the board, both in its role as independent tribunal and as a designatee in place of the chief under the Placer Mining Act. I think it's very clear when acting under the Placer Mining Act that the board probably has a duty to consult, right? The board is standing in for the Crown in that position very clearly. But there's a bunch of other recent case law, Kitsim-Kalem, Clyde River, that address the issue of independent tribunals. And basically they say, an independent tribunal may not be the Crown, but their decisions will attract the duty to consult where they become the vehicles through which the Crown acts, right? And so the entire HIDA framework for rights and title are, I feel our experience is that that's not well understood amongst, staff departments in the Yukon, right? I think there's such an attachment to the umbrella final agreement and the version of consultation that is set out there. And Beckman made it very clear that that's not the only version of consultation that applies, that the common law duty will apply as well, both in the context of final agreement First Nations, but certainly in the context of those outside of final agreements. And, you know, an independent or regulatory body, it can either, you know, it's possible for the Crown to say, we're depending on their process to consult. And of course, Yukon does this with with YESIV all the time, right? Points to YESIV and says, they don't say they're responsible for consulting, but they say, we're going to look at their process to determine the depth of our consultation, right? So you're going to provide information on your rights and title, like here's the evidence of your strength of claim, here's the evidence of potential impacts, and we'll use that to guide our consultation process with the First Nation. The board, of course, is a different position because the board is an actual decision maker. And, you know, I think that what LFN is going to need going forward with the board is clarity, right? And understanding that, you know, we know the board has responsibilities. You know, it's even described in the MOU with Yukon is the board has responsibilities with respect to final agreement First Nations. But again, with respect to those outside of final agreements, there's kind of a giant hole there. And I think that the board has tools, whether policy, regulatory, otherwise, it probably has some space to address that hole. But I think that, you know, at the very least, LFN is going to be expecting the board to look at the consultation that the Crown has done and as part of their decision, make a determination about whether that consultation was sufficient or not. And that's when acting as an independent tribunal. I note that in the Kitsim-Kalem case, that was about, I think, BC Utilities Commission. The court looked at a clause that just says, you know, the commission can consider any other matters it deems appropriate, and looked at that clause and said, yeah, that tribunal can make a decision about the sufficiency of consultation. So I think that this is really important, that we're going to have to fill in some gaps and have some understanding about what role the board is going to play with respect to consultation. Is it going to be doing it itself through its processes? Certainly the processes seem capable of doing a lot of the work of consultation and making some decisions about accommodations. Although, you know, I think accommodations respecting impacts on title are going to be difficult. They're difficult for the Crown to struggle with, to understand the economic interests of Aboriginal title. But I think that, you know, it's going to require creative use of the tools that are available to the board. So I'm going to pass things off to the LFN Lands Director, Travis Stewart, now, but that's kind of the general framework, and I'm happy to talk at length with the board about understanding and shaping up consultation and what the consultation spectrum looks like. So thank you. Travis?
Thanks, Drew. The Kaska have never ceded, surrendered, or extinguished their Aboriginal title or the right to make land management decisions. In making this decision 25 years ago, LFN is now duty-bound to understand, protect, and sustain their citizens' exercises of Kaska Aboriginal rights throughout Kaska traditional territory. 4 Kaska rights holders are also uniquely disadvantaged when it comes to the governance of Kaska territory in the Yukon, as are our non-Kaska neighbors. The Crown discriminates against LFN by refusing to establish renewable resource councils and therefore the intimate interconnections with the Yukon Fish and Wildlife Management Board. There is no land use planning commission to facilitate and guide the vital public policy tool. Legislation enacted the institute and empower the Yukon Environmental and Economic Assessment Board has never addressed the unique constitutional obligations of the Crown and Canadians associated with Kaska Aboriginal rights and our Aboriginal title. We are of the belief that the legislation that gives rise to and empowers the Yukon Water Board is similarly unhelpful when addressing the legal, political, and cultural realities of the existence of Kaska Aboriginal rights, including Aboriginal title. The only remedy LFN sees for overcoming these structural deficiencies throughout Southeast Yukon is that unique approaches must be found for fulfilling all public interests and good governance mandates for each independent public body created by the UFA. The Yukon Water Board must adapt within the parameters of its existing enabling legislation if it is to be relevant and effective in Southeast Yukon. To be clear, LFN supports development within Kaska Traditional Territory, where we can be sure that exercises of Kaska Aboriginal rights will remain meaningful over time. This requires careful consideration of harmful effects on Kaska Aboriginal rights, the availability of mitigations to avoid or reduce those effects, and the likelihood that accommodations will actually address harms to the Kaska when mitigations cannot. These matters are key factors for the Yukon Water Board whenever it considers issuing a water license. None of these factors can be properly weighed without Kaska involvement in deep consultation, because without deep consultation, LFN will not be in a position to provide its free, prior, and informed consent. Deep consultation will further require proponents, public and private, to ensure that LFN has the financial, technical, and organizational capacity to achieve independent assurance through its own internal review of projects. Independent assurance is about technical, scientific, and Kaska experts doing the work necessary to independently inform LFN citizens about what the effects projects and Crown decisions have on Kaska Aboriginal rights and title. LFN strives for independent assurance to inform processes like the water boards, because without it, consultation deficiencies will occur and will be on a trajectory to conflict. The necessity of this objective view, even in quasi-judicial processes, is obvious. In a recent YESA process without Kaska input, a draft screening report said that a major mine project would have no significant impact on caribou. LFN's hard work in its process of gaining independent assurance and then informing the YESA process with its vital Kaska voice helped to change YESA's significance determination around caribou. LFN also believes that the Yukon Water Board cannot make significantly and legally sound decisions without comprehensive baseline information about the watersheds where development is proposed. Nor is that baseline information enough by itself. The board must also understand how the Kaska traditionally use and manage watersheds and the species that call them home. There can be no understanding of mitigations without understanding the connectedness of wetlands to watersheds, watersheds to ecosystems, and human cultures to the ecosystems they inhabit. The Yukon Water Board must be certain that it understands these interrelationships well before issuing a water license. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart, and thank you, Mr. Milden. Much appreciated. May I turn it over to the board members for questions, please? Mr. Warnsby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Stewart, Mr. Milton. Question, I think probably for Mr. Milton. Mr. Milton, you spoke widely speaking about the need for studies of Kaska rights entitled a Kaska rights database, Kaska understanding of the rights, understanding of cumulative impacts, the broad understanding of rights entitled, something that might be very broadly similar to what would occur within the land planning process prior to the issuance of plastic mine authorizations, water licenses. I'm just wondering, in your view, there's obviously many ways it could be structured, but in your view, who would be responsible to pay for that? Is that something that would be the responsibility of an applicant? Is that something that would fall on the Crown? Is it something that could fall upon the water that could fall on the water board as the independent regulator? Just some clarity around that, I think, would be helpful for us to understand our broad-based responsibilities with regard to First Nations without final agreements, and generally in LFN in particular, via Vista duty to consult. Thank you.
Thank you to the board member. I appreciate the question, Mr. Warnsby. I think the reality is the decision maker has a responsibility, whether that's the Crown, whether it's a tribunal standing in for the Crown, or the board acting as a designatee. At the end of the day, the Crown has to assure itself that consultation was sufficient, and that if that consultation demonstrates that accommodation is necessary, that that accommodation is sufficient. You know, Liard First Nation has a lands person, not a lands department, in a territory that is large, in a territory that is covered with Class 1 to Class 4 quartz mining permits, forestry applications, 3 jurisdictions, BC, Yukon, and the NWT. And, you know, at the end of the day, that is a huge weight that the First Nation is bearing. And being asked to do the consultation that enables other people to come into the territory and do things for their own commercial benefit. You know, if you can hear the anger creeping into my voice, you'll understand. That is, you know, a structure designed to fail the First Nation and designed to fail the justice that is promised by Canada's Constitution and Section 35 rights and title. So, you know, at the end of the day, the Crown has to make a decision whether consultation was sufficient. If that work is not done, you know, then it's very hard to understand how consultation or accommodation could have been done usefully and effectively. You know, I think that on individual projects, it seems pretty clear to me that proponents have a responsibility, right? If they're looking to turn a profit, there's a capital cost to be involved here, and one of those capital costs is to deal with the landlord, who is the First Nation. But the other, you know, the reality is it falls on the Crown to make sure that it's in a position to make decisions, that it has the information that is required to do so. And that information is, you know, from complex scientific information to information about rights and title in all their complexity. And in the complexity of dealing with Casca ways of knowing and understanding the world and their lands, and the connection of themselves to their lands. So, you know, it's hard for me to develop much sympathy for the Crown in that situation. If they want to make decisions that give away Casca lands or impact Casca rights, they need to pay for it in advance.
Sorry, I was speaking to myself. Apparently the mic wasn't on. I apologize for that. Any other questions? Well, I'd like to, Mr. Milton, I'd like to thank you for, and Mr. Stewart, thank you for your presentation. It's useful to hear from you, even in the context of the broader issues around resource development, even if the traffic in terms of placer mining applications is limited. As you've pointed out, clearly there are many other instances of resource development that will cross the path of the Water Board, and so hearing from you this morning has certainly been very useful. And I can assure you that we are very, very keenly interested in the subject as you've both described it, and we're all trying to understand very clearly what the limitations of what the practical limitations of the First Nation are when it comes to receiving requests, but also what duties and obligations there are amongst the various parties to ensure that proper decisions are made. So thank you for your contribution this morning. That brings us to a break time, and I would suggest that we the first up in terms of closing remarks is the Yukon Conservation Society. They are slated at 10:40. I would suggest that we determine whether or not they're available at 10:25, and otherwise, because we don't need long breaks, but.
Mr. Chair, I'm available at 10:25.
Okay, why don't we?
Conservation Society.
Thank you very much. Why don't we start with the Conservation Society at 10:25, and people can recharge their coffee cups and do their health breaks as they need to at this moment. So 10:25, and we'll reconvene. Okay, folks, we'll reconvene. Thank you. This begins our round of closing remarks, and with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Jones with the Yukon Conservation Society.
Good morning. Thank you. In this closing statement, I want to quickly address wetland conservation and reclamation objectives and to address some of the issues raised during the hearings. These themes and the ones raised in our presentation will be further developed in our written submission. I think the best way to understand the watershed objective for wetlands reclamation is by examining the fish habitat management system for placer mining. The aquatic health objectives are measured using the Canadian Aquatic Biomonitoring Network, or CABN protocol, which not only looks at species abundance and richness, but how it compares to a reference condition. In other words, what it's supposed to be in its natural state. Dr. Foote spoke to this when he discussed the meaning of a transformation of a bog fen complex to a pond upland landscape. And I suggest that a modification of this process would be the best way to assess the ecological health of a watershed. For example, simply increasing the number of ducks in a landscape is no more relevant to ecosystem health than increasing the number of blackfly larvae is to aquatic health in the fish habitat management system. It's my understanding that the Wildlife Conservation Society has a project underway to do exactly this, to develop a system for measuring ecosystem health in placer streams. As the presentation of the Yukon Chamber of Mines observed, wetlands are complex, and it took natural processes thousands of years for these complexes to be created. The hubris all too often demonstrated by humanity that we can improve on nature is writ large in some of the reclamation concepts presented to us. The wetlands reclamation objectives should be that wetlands function as they did before disturbance. If, as the Chamber of Mines asserts, it is impossible to reclaim peatlands, then they should probably not be disturbed. At the very least, the land should be left in a state conducive to natural reclamation to its original state, not into a very different mix of ponds and uplands. To refer to some of the other presentations in the form of a rebuttal, YCS is of the opinion that the Yukon Water Board does have jurisdiction over wetlands. Wetlands are defined by water, and the Yukon Water Board deals with it. Water flows through a fen, water flows through a river, water resides in a pond. All of these landforms fall under the jurisdiction of the Yukon Water Board. As is noted on the Yukon Water Board website, under the Yukon Waters Act, the Yukon Water Board issues water licenses for various activities for the use of water and or the deposit of waste to water. Our process promotes the balance of conservation, development, and utilization of Yukon water for all Yukoners and Canadians. And this description most definitely includes placer mining and wetlands. For what it's worth, YCS would like the board to note that YESIB has been considering the impact of placer mining on a wetland. Since 2013, YESIB has been recommending that placer miners avoid Indian River wetlands. And my final point, the 87% of wetlands that have been lost globally were lost incrementally, using the justification that wetlands are extensive and not rare, and that the footprint of any particular disturbance is minuscule. Nonetheless, in this way, through 1,000 small cuts, as was observed Tuesday by the TH Director of Natural Resources, most wetlands have been lost. That we are considering the impacts to wetlands and how we can reduce them and how to steward wetlands is a very good sign. I agree with Brooke Rudolph that we can work collectively to come up with a way forward that protects wetlands. We very much appreciate having had this opportunity, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. Is the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society ready to go?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, I'll turn it over to you then.
Great, thank you. All right. My name is Randy Newton. I'm the Conservation Manager for CPAWS Yukon. Thank you to the Water Board for the opportunity to provide closing comments. And thank you to everyone who's participated in this hearing. There were many excellent presentations and some really powerful testimony. I'd like to start off by reaffirming a few points from my earlier presentation. Many have said this over the last few days, that we are transforming landscapes, including their functions and benefits, without the baseline information to know what we're changing, and without understanding ecological thresholds or the thresholds of change that people find acceptable. CPAWS has suggested a no net loss of benefits as an objective, that decisions be precautionary, that licenses be paused until land use planning provides a framework for the board to make these decisions in a way that aligns with the final agreements and Aboriginal rights. I have two clarifications that I'd like to make. The first, it was suggested during the presentation by the Placer Miners Association that I had said traditional knowledge should not be provided by placer miners. And this was used to support the assertion that this information is better considered by YESA and not the Water Board. While I did say that traditional knowledge cannot be provided by placer miners in a meaningful way, I also said this information was critically important to decisions that the Water Board makes. I pointed to the importance of using a process like land use planning or deep consultation undertaken with First Nations to incorporate this kind of information, as well as other critically important information. It's just impossible to get at the scale of an application, including hydrological and ecological information at a watershed scale. For my second clarification, it was suggested during the legal presentation for the Placer Miners Association that I had urged consistency with the Water Board's guidelines and the forthcoming wetland policy. And this point about consistency was used to support an assertion that the Water Board guidelines somehow preempt the finalization of the Yukon wetland policy. I'm not sure that I explicitly urge consistency. Of course, in principle, that makes sense to me. But I want to make it clear that I certainly do not believe the Water Board should wait for the wetland policy to be complete to act on the findings of this hearing. And I actually feel quite strongly the opposite is true, that the board should act now. The wetland policy is going to be a high-level enabling framework. It's not legislative. It's going to get its regulatory teeth from YESEB and the Water Board. It's meant to sustain wetland benefits for all. We're likely years away from an implementation plan for the policy. We also know that a large impetus for the policy was the situation in the Indian River. Issuing licenses according to the status quo, I believe, would put the board further out of alignment with the ultimate goals of that policy. The wetland policy is going to include many important pieces. Tyler Kuhn spoke to many of them, including a process for identifying wetlands of special importance, setting priorities for research, and getting some momentum behind a territorial wetland inventory. But the part of the plan that applies to the Water Board most is the section on managing human impacts. And it's going to look a lot like this. I don't believe this in and of itself is going to provide the board with the clarity it's seeking now. On the screen, what I've pulled up is the mitigation hierarchy. It's a standard tool to include in wetland plans. It's a tool that says first, avoid wetland impacts, minimize impacts, restore what's been lost, and offset what you haven't been able to restore. But the issue facing the board, and also YESAB, is going to be how projects move through these steps. And if there's a point at which a license is rejected because it wasn't able to sufficiently achieve one of them. Tyler Kuhn from Yukon Environment said that the plan would include some guiding principles to help move through these steps. But even these principles leave gaps that the Water Board will be well served to start addressing now. I pulled up some of them on my screen. I should have taken a screenshot, but I wrote as many as I could. Where I see gaps, I've highlighted in green, moving through these steps, keeping cumulative loss below ecological thresholds. We don't know what those are yet. We should start working on that now. Minimizing the loss of benefits. What are the benefits that we're seeking to minimize the loss of? Seems like a good question for land use planning. What circumstances is loss permissible? What does a heavily impacted watershed mean? So my advice to the board is to move forward with the findings of this hearing and not to wait until a wetland policy is in place. Of course, it's important to ensure consistency between the board's guidelines, but this is something that can be achieved with ongoing coordination between the board and Yukon government. I'd also like to briefly address something that came up a few times, which is to generally continue business as usual, but to use adaptive management. Among other places, this was suggested under recommendation 8.2 and the recommendation by Ecofish Research and ASLA Consulting. And it was continue to develop best practices and regulations that include allowance for adaptive management. And I'm addressing this point because I always get very nervous when I hear that term. Done right and under the right conditions, adaptive management is a powerful tool. But often it can be used as a way to kick a can down the road. Keep the status quo with a little bit of ad hoc research and some unsystematic monitoring thrown in. And here I'm drawing from the U.S. Department of the Interior's Adaptive Management Technical Guide. And they define adaptive management as a systematic approach for improving resource management by learning from management outcomes. The guide notes fairly explicitly, it's thought by many that merely monitoring activities and occasionally changing them, one is doing adaptive management. But what it actually involves is exploring alternatives to meet objectives, predicting the outcomes of alternatives based on the current state of knowledge, implementing an alternative, monitoring to learn about the impacts of actions, and then using these results to update knowledge and adjust management actions. So it's a systematic and it's a rigorous process. I do think that adaptive management is going to be needed to achieve the objectives the Water Board adopts for wetland conservation, development, and use. And I think it's going to be a way to reduce some of that fuzziness of how individual applications fit within these objectives. But the most important thing, we first need to define the objectives that we're working towards. And these objectives need to be measurable so we can measure progress towards them and also see if we're deviating from them so we can adjust management actions. And as I've said, and others have said, these are best set through land use planning or consultation. Ad hoc improvements to the status quo is not an objective. In addition, when adaptive management is taken on, agencies have to be willing to commit for the long term, covering long-term costs, long-term funding, and it requires a strong institutional framework. Agencies have to commit to a schedule for monitoring, analysis, and re-examining decisions. And this is the perfect approach to embed after land use planning has occurred, to set objectives and thresholds and identify the values and benefits that should be maintained on a landscape. I do believe that thinking through this approach will help the board start to clarify the information that is required to evaluate a water license application. Related to that, I do agree with the points made by the Placer Miners Association and the Chamber of Mines that clarity on information required for applications would be helpful. I believe things like decision-making criteria and thresholds for the requested information were mentioned, guidance on data collection methods, and if this can be done by an applicant or must be done by a qualified professional, and what information for an application is required or what's recommended. And this clarity will help link projects to an adaptive management approach once land use planning or deep consultation has provided the framework to do that in. And I would like to end on one final point. It was suggested that placer mining has a small footprint in the territory and therefore minimal impact on the general health of wetland complexes in the north. The Placer Miners Association asserted that disturbance in the Indian River drainage is only 1.62% of wetland and riparian area in Gwitchin's traditional territory. I believe the conclusion drawn was that guidelines are unnecessary and redundant and land use planning not needed with this relatively small footprint. And I have 3 points to make about this. The first, impact is based on context. If you cut a tree down in the forest, I'm not impacted. It's just one tree. If you cut a tree down and it falls on my car, then I'm impacted. If you cut a tree down and it falls on someone I love, then I'm really impacted. The point is that impact from from activities emerge in context, geographic, ecological, historical, and cultural context. Processes like land use planning help us understand these impacts on different values. The second point, the statement that placer mining has a small footprint and therefore minimal impact doesn't align in any way with the testimony that I've heard during this hearing, including from Gwitchin and Hwëch'in. What I heard was people say things like, we are losing our learning environment and young people feel a profound sense of loss. Dr. Lee Foote showed photos of the upper reaches of the Indian River where the water is noticeably clearer. The lower reaches are sediment laden and starting to form deltas. This does not seem like a minimal impact to me. And my third point, 1.62% disturbance was presented as a small number. And it does sound small without any kind of context. And yesterday I was trying to think through that number and put it in context for myself. And I remembered that cumulative thresholds on development have been set in the North Yukon Regional Plan and the Peel Regional Plan, and I was curious what they were. And these thresholds are set to set acceptable limits on human disturbance in zones that permit development. And computer modeling with many inputs was used to do that. The plans are very clear. These thresholds are exceeded. The result could be undesirable effects on ecological and cultural resources. Before I get to what the thresholds are, to be clear, these thresholds are set for areas of the Peel that permit development, the working landscape. They don't apply to the entire Peel. So for instance, if you can follow my pointer, this zone here permits development and it will have its own threshold. This will have thresholds, and then these zones here will have a threshold of development. And if you look at this chart, it's quite striking that the highest level of recommended disturbance for areas that permit development is 1%. That's for areas that permit the highest level of development. Of course, these thresholds aren't directly comparable to the 1.62% figure, I'm providing them for some context. These thresholds were set based on effects to migratory caribou and for a landscape with a certain topography, and so they are not directly comparable. But nonetheless, I find it pretty alarming. We've reached what is actually a high level of disturbance to wetlands without any kind of guiding land use plan. I said earlier that the situation in the Indian River amounted to de facto land use planning, and this number jolted me to feel even more strongly about that. I don't believe we can continue this way. We can't pull numbers and thresholds out of thin air. They need to be thoughtfully set in response to context and to conserve the values that matter. And so with that, I urge the board to hit pause until it can make decisions with a full understanding of what's at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next statement, closing remarks would come from Government of Yukon. Is the Government of Yukon ready to proceed?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we are. Again, my name is John Bailey. I'm Deputy Minister of Environment, and I'll be giving our closing remarks this morning. I want to take the opportunity to again thank the board for hosting this conversation and taking the time to make sure that all voices get heard. It's a little tricky to do that in these circumstances, and I think there's been a real commendable job of making sure that we get to hear all the perspectives on this. Hearing directly from each other and seeking areas of common interest, it's going to be critical in charting a path forward on this issue. I also want to thank all the other participants and presenters who've been engaging in the conversation and made representations over the last couple of days. The level of interest, it's a clear indication of how important a matter this is and how we manage impacts on wetlands. Over the last few days, we've heard about the importance of wetlands, both the people living in the Yukon and to the Yukon's environment itself, and the testimony of both elders and youth about the cultural importance of wetlands and their reuse and passing along culture and traditions, it had a particular resonance for me, and I think others as well. We've heard about the importance of placer mining, its role in maintaining a rich and prosperous Yukon economy, and the efforts that are being made in the industry towards socially and environmentally responsible development and site reclamation. We've heard about how wetlands play an integral component, or they're an integral component of a much more complex and interconnected system, and that this needs to be considered when managing our impacts on these systems. During our representation on Tuesday, the board asked us to provide some additional comments on the 3 questions they posed. I think it was Bruce Warnsby who put that fairly succinctly, and I think, Anne, your questions were kind of getting at the same thing, that you were looking for, some clarity on our responses on those questions. So I did undertake at that time to try to address those or provide additional comments on those 3 questions. And I'd like to do that right now. The first question was, what information should be required to support a water license application related to placer activities in wetland areas? So as I mentioned on Tuesday, on January 29, 2020, Yukon government provided feedback to the board on the draft wetland plan guidelines as they were known at that time. I'm not going to get into all the details of that correspondence, but I want to touch on a few of the key points that were raised then. As has been highlighted during the hearing, the information required to make licensing decisions under the Waters Act and under the Placer Mining Act are different, and our comments here refer to the broad mandate of the Water Board under all relevant legislation. In an ideal world, we believe that regulators should have all the necessary information before them when making decisions that enable them to consider the full project, its impacts and mitigations, to determine appropriate regulatory mitigations as defined by and aligned with their legislative mandates. But in the real world, we rarely have complete information to consider when making decisions, and there will continue to be many circumstances when this information is incomplete. This is particularly the nature of the case when dealing with issues like wetlands and northern environments, where our knowledge base is not complete, but it's expanding very rapidly. Our view is that this will continue to be a requirement to make decisions, and that decisions should be made using the best available information. We're also of the view that, to the extent possible, information requirements should be harmonized and aligned through the assessment of regulatory processes. We noted earlier that the draft Yukon wetlands policy requires a wetlands impact mitigation plan for all projects and activities that could impact on a wetland. It will be important to also align the information requirements of such plans with the requirements of existing regulatory and assessment processes. And this work is still to come. And this speaks to our point about trying to harmonize some of these requirements so that there's some consistency, and it makes it simpler for those that are applying and also those that are intervening. We remain committed to working with the Yukon Water Board, the Yukon Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Board, and others to advance this sort of alignment. The second question was, what should the wetland conservation development and utilization objectives be for a watershed, and how can they be balanced on an application by application basis? We believe the best time and place for establishing broad regional or watershed targets is through the land use planning discussions. How to consider these objectives in advance of the finalization of land use plans becomes a challenging topic. In the absence of a final land use plan, the Yukon-wide wetland stewardship policy and its implementation guidance could provide direction on this question through the identification of wetlands of special importance, as well as through the application of the mitigation hierarchy that's currently in the draft plan. This policy, as drafted, will require a wetland impact mitigation plan for all projects that impact wetlands. The guiding principles for the application of the mitigation hierarchy will provide the basis for decision-making through the consideration of key issues, including cumulative effects and that some wetlands warrant a higher level of protection. For instance, these principles are expected to inform regulatory decisions on protection of particular types of wetlands, an example being those that may be very hard to reclaim, as well as to whether a project in a specific location should be allowed to proceed or not. We acknowledge that there's more work to be done to provide the detailed guidance that regulators will need. And where the situation merits, Yukon government has developed additional policy guidance that can be used in an application by application basis. And I'm speaking now as an example about the interim approach for the Indian River, which falls into this category. As noted during the hearing, this interim approach or policy covers off a large portion of placer mining operation currently in the Yukon, as well as a large portion of the license applications that are coming before the board. This policy sets out both the requirement for a wetland reclamation plan, as well as protection requirements for some specific wetland types. Currently, the reclamation plan is approved post-licensing by the Chief of Placer Land Use, and so comes in at the very tail end of the assessment and regulatory process. We've heard from numerous parties about the interest to align processes and to front-load this information provision. Yukon government is open to these discussions with all parties about the best way to do this in relation to the requirements under this interim approach. The government of the Yukon's view is that the interim approach balances wetland conservation, development, and utilization objectives for the Indian River watershed. The balance for other watersheds might be different. As we discussed at length in our presentation on Tuesday, we also remain committed to updating and revising the interim approach. And we believe the best way to do this is through ongoing discussions with partners, in particular Klondike, Gwitchin, but other stakeholders in the, or stakeholders in the placer industry and others. The third question was what wetland reclamation objectives should be considered during the water licensing process. Wetland reclamation objectives will vary from place to place and watershed to watershed. In the Indian River watershed, our current policy, the interim approach, establishes that hard to reclaim wetlands, bogs, and fens are provided partial protection from disturbance. On top of this, a reclamation plan is required for all wetlands that are disturbed. Yukon government has provided guidance on how to develop a reclamation plan. This is currently in the form of the wetland reclamation guide for the Ruby Creek and Indian River East Block placer mine. It's also known as Northern Exposures Project, or YESA file 2015-0120. The Klondike Placer Miners Association has developed their best management practices for placer mining in the Yukon wetlands, and Klondike developed the Klondike placer-specific wetlands reclamation guidelines. As mentioned on Tuesday, the Yukon government continues to be committed to working with Klondike and others on finalizing a revised reclamation guide. But until this work's done, our view is that the aforementioned Northern Exposures Reclamation Guide provides guidance on both the wetland reclamation objectives, as well as some concrete examples of methods and approaches and indicators of success. As stated in the current guide, the goal of wetland reclamation is to preserve the wetland functions of an area by minimizing the disturbance footprint and by creating self-sustaining wetland conditions following disturbance, which are similar to pre-disturbance conditions and which perform similar functions. The Indian River interim approach and its wetland reclamation guide are scoped to the Indian River area. Yukon government's view is that solutions for other watersheds and areas may be different as the biophysical, historical, economic, cultural, and ecological contexts may also differ. Many areas are not under as much development pressure today, nor have they seen as much past disturbance and development. The Yukon Wetlands Policy is expected to provide guidance about the use of the mitigation hierarchy, that is, avoid, minimize, and reclaim areas where wetlands have been impacted. The policy is also expected to provide some general guidance about reclamation. The current draft policy sets out that reclamation is required for all non-permanent wetland impacts. Secondly, that there's not always a requirement to reclaim wetlands to the original class, i.e. like for like. And we've heard that this goal is unrealistic for some wetland types like bogs and fens in any reasonable time frame. Loss of wetland benefits is permissible in some circumstances. Cumulative wetland loss is kept well below the ecological thresholds for the watershed. This may mean that as reclamation occurs, additional impacts may be permissible so long as cumulative effects or disturbances remain below a certain level. The determination of reclamation objectives for other watersheds will need to consider the specific context. The absence of specific guidance for other watersheds, and prior to the finalization of the Yukon Wetlands policy, we believe elements of the reclamation guide for northern exposures could be used or adopted where required. We also wanted to provide comments on another item that came up during the hearing. There were several discussions over the course of the hearing about the need for more information, the need to finalize policies, and the need to carry out land use planning. Perspectives have been shared on, I was going to say both sides, but numerous sides. Some are of the view that all placer mining activities in wetlands should stop while research, planning, and study are completed. In some cases, there were references to specific sections of the Waters Act, specifically subsection 32.1 and subsection 32.2. In this first subsection allows the Commissioner and Executive Council to make an order to reserve lands from disposition for a specified period or otherwise for the protection of any waters. The second subsection allows the Commissioner and Executive Council to make an order to direct the Yukon Water Board not to issue any licenses for a period of time. You know, in our view, to be clear, is that the Yukon government does not intend to issue any orders prohibiting placer mining in wetlands, nor do we plan to issue any orders halting or freezing current or future applications related to placer mining in wetlands. The Yukon government is of the view that the board has a statutory responsibility to continue deliberations on applications before it. So a couple of quick closing remarks. As a public government, Yukon government has a responsibility to try to take the interests of all Yukoners into account. We acknowledge that the broad set of values and interests that Yukoners have when it comes to wetlands. The government of Yukon will continue to actively pursue how to best balance interests in wetlands by working with First Nations, industry, regulators like the Yukon Water Board, and other stakeholders. Collectively, we have made considerable progress, but again acknowledge that the rate of response and the change is not rapid enough for some. Since this issue came to public prominence around 2013, we've added considerably to our knowledge of wetlands. We've shared information with each other. We've worked with partners to develop an approach that strikes an appropriate balance between conservation and development in the Indian River. And we have committed to revising this approach as we learn more. We've also made significant progress on developing a Yukon-wide wetlands policy, and the Dawson Regional Land Use Planning process is well underway. Our goal through developing and applying these different initiatives is to balance development and economic opportunities with the conservation of wetlands, including the protection of the most sensitive wetlands, in a manner that best meets the interests of Yukoners over the long term. We will continue to adapt our approach as we learn more and evaluate how it's working. We look forward to continuing to work with the Water Board and all partners and stakeholders on this important and complex matter. Once again, I thank you on behalf of the Government of Yukon for the opportunity to provide representation at this hearing in the public interest. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey, for providing closing remarks for the Government of Yukon and your summary of the issues. I would like to turn it over now to the Klondike, if they're ready to provide closing remarks.
We are ready, Mr. Chair, and I want to make sure you hear me before I start.
I can hear you, see you.
Perfect. Well, congratulations to Zoom. The platform has held up well over these last 3 days. And like the other presenters that have gone before, we also wanted to thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, my name is Micah Clark. I'm legal counsel to Klondike, Gwitchin. And before I provide closing remarks on behalf of Klondike, Gwitchin, TH wanted me to express their gratitude to the board for holding this public interest hearing and to the other Yukon First Nations and other organizations that have presented over these last few days. And that's not empty thanks. We recognize the work that went on behind the scenes by Caleb, by Ms. Pollock, by others to prepare for this hearing. We recognize the thoughtfulness of the questions posed by the board, and we've seen on our screens the attention that each board member has given to the testimony and information provided over the last 3 days. And so we'd like to convey our thanks for your efforts, your interest, and your recognition that placer mining in wetlands is a topic that must be considered. But as we noted in our presentation on Tuesday night, it's TH's view that placer mining in wetlands must not only be considered, but it must be addressed by concrete actions. And the status quo, or the status quo combined with statements or policies or protections that may someday be put in place, is not tenable. And so we want to start by reiterating what precisely that status quo is. And YESAB has repeatedly determined that proponents must not mine in undisturbed wetlands. Just 3 months ago, YESAB found in an evaluation report, and this is a quote, "The Indian River Valley wetlands are of high ecological and sociocultural importance. They're vulnerable to change. They cannot be effectively replaced given the complexity of restoring wetlands. It is likely that mining in the Indian River wetland complex has already surpassed the threshold of social acceptability. The ecological value of wetlands is also unlikely to be effectively restored to its original function once disturbed. Changes to the ecosystem are not well understood and have not yet been effectively monitored." That's YESAB's finding. The board has heard a lot of evidence over the last 3 days, but it has not heard evidence in TH's view that can possibly contradict those findings by YESAB. And with all due respect, Mr. Chair, select photos of select former mine sites that are now covered in trees or shrubs or grass certainly does not contradict those findings by YESAB. And the conclusion to YESAB's evaluation report 3 months ago was again a recommendation that the proponent shall not mine or develop mining-related infrastructure within any undisturbed wetland. And this is more or less the same recommendation YESAB has made since their February 2016 evaluation report for the Northern Exposures Project. That's been mentioned a few times so far throughout this hearing. That was 4.5 years ago. And as far as TH is aware, YG has varied this recommendation continually over that time. So mining projects in the Indian River wetlands and throughout Yukon keep getting licensed. And TH's view is that this creates a situation that requires concrete action. So what can be done now and what can be done by the board? The board has heard a lot of information on those questions over the last 3 days. And to be helpful, we wanted to organize our closing remarks and the information that the board has heard over the last 3 days on matters where the presenters seem to largely agree and matters where there was some disagreement. And we'll do that divided under the 3 questions posed by the board. And we'll start with question 2. What should wetland conservation, development, and utilization objectives be? And how can they be balanced on an application by application basis? There seemed to be, Mr. Chair, general agreement among the presenters that we simply don't know enough about wetlands, how much there is, what types they are, where they are, what functions other than cultural and ecological functions they serve. There also seemed to be general agreement from what we heard that some wetlands need to be protected, and we need thresholds for disturbance on a watershed basis, not just a claim by claim or block by block basis. There is agreement that we need planning to identify areas to be protected and areas that should be open to industry. Whether that's through a wetland policy, regional or sub-regional land use planning, watershed planning, or a cumulative effects study is to be seen. YG's presentation on Tuesday and again right now referred to work in this regard, but conceded it would be a long time coming. What shouldn't be denied is that there is a tipping point for wetlands. In any watershed where destruction or substantial conversion will cause an ecosystem collapse and cultural alienation. The only conclusion that can be drawn in TH's view from the information presented by the board this week is that with our current knowledge, we don't know where that tipping point is. For the Indian River wetlands, YESAB has already found that until clearer direction and data are provided, the only effective mitigation to eliminate, reduce, or control significant adverse effects to wetlands is to avoid mining or developing mining infrastructure within any remaining undisturbed wetland habitat. And in the absence of a big picture policy or planning document setting out what must be protected, it falls to the regulator, it falls to this board to make that determination in TH's view. So TH's position is that this board should adopt the precautionary approach for all wetlands, not just in TH's traditional territory, but Yukon, urged by YESAB. And as mentioned on Tuesday, further to this, TH's recommendation in response to the board's first question is unless and until there are effective measures in place to protect and reclaim wetlands, and the board has the information it needs to conclusively determine that further activities will not irreversibly harm the functionality of a wetland complex, the board must reject license applications for activities in wetlands. And that is, TH says, clearly within the board's powers. As Judge Vail ruled in the Western Copper decision, the discretion of the water board to not issue a license exists even after the issuance of a positive decision document. And we know that because TH negotiated at 1487 of its final agreement in deciding whether to issue a license. Rejecting licenses is not a fettering of discretion, nor is it contrary to administrative law principles. Of course, the board can and must still hear and decide licensing applications, but TH says it can and should reject those applications unless and until there's a conclusive determination that further activities will not irreversibly harm the functionality of a wetland complex. So that leads us to the board's next question. What should wetland reclamation objectives be? And there was substantial agreement from what we heard, Mr. Chair, that full peatland restoration on the scale required is just simply not possible. As well, there was no legitimate contradiction of the fact that mining and the conversion of wetlands leads to irreparable cultural loss. And as just one example, the board heard from TH citizen Darren Taylor, who spoke passionately about the impossibility of hunting among gravel piles and ponds, and the fact that dramatic changes to the landscape made him not even want to return to the Indian River anymore. The board heard direct evidence that mining conversion of wetland impacts use by TH citizens, and by doing so, mining interferes with the exercise of their treaty rights to hunt and fish and enjoy other spiritual and cultural activities throughout their traditional territory. Activities they practice for thousands of years. And above and beyond that, we also heard how culture is passed down to future generations by being on the land. And as Yukon First Nation people stop being on the land and performing traditional activities that rely on wetlands, their culture and their identity are lost forever. And we've not heard anyone seriously dispute that. The presenters were also largely in agreement that we simply don't know with any certainty what the environmental effects of conversion are. We heard board member Leckie ask YG directly, do we know the effects in terms of loss of carbon storage from converting peatlands to open water? YG conceded we don't, but the conversion of millions of tons of peat to atmospheric carbon is assured. And moreover, the Ducks Unlimited presentation showed there may be other significant and adverse environmental impacts. The big argument that we heard in support of conversion to open water seems to be an increase in biodiversity, but those arguments in TH's view are based on limited studies of birds and don't take into account the full range of species that use wetlands. Artificially increasing biodiversity may introduce species that are not natural in the environment and that themselves have impacts that we don't understand. The goal of reclamation should not be on biodiversity, but on reclaiming the broad set of functions that natural wetlands in Yukon perform so as to support traditional uses, cultural values, and benefits to all Yukoners. Different classes of wetlands provide different functions. There's no disagreement about that. But we can't overlook the larger effects on the environment as a whole of making changes, particularly in sensitive permafrost wetlands. So where does that information leave the board? In TH's view, the decision of wetlands reclamation objectives is a policy decision that should be made by YG collaboratively with Yukon First Nations, but we have not yet developed that policy. We have not yet developed a policy that Yukon First Nations support, and TH is on the record as not supporting or accepting the Northern Exposures Guidelines that was just referenced in the closing remarks of YG. So again, in the absence of that consent It falls to the board, it falls to the regulator to make this determination in the meantime. And again, TH's position is the board should not at this time authorize new disturbance of wetlands, but for existing disturbances and for any future projects, once planning processes are complete, TH's position on wetlands reclamation objectives is set out in their guidelines that were referred to in our presentation. And in short, the objectives establish an order of preference. As a priority, replace what was there with the same thing, and where that's not possible, at least replace the functions. To support these objectives, we have to ensure that miners have the financial resources to carry out reclamation. On this last point of financial resources, Professor Lee's presentation on Tuesday showed there's substantial cost even to basic reclamation. And conversely, we heard from KPMA that many miners don't have access to financing and are working within extremely tight margins. And in these circumstances, the board must ensure that applicants can complete effective reclamation, that reclamation is not ultimately left undone or left to the public or public government. The board not only has the power, but in TH's view, it has the duty under Section 12(4)D of the Waters Act to, and this is a quote, not issue a license unless the applicant satisfies the board that the financial responsibility of the applicant is adequate for such mitigative measures as shall be required. And the satisfactory maintenance and restoration, not just reclamation, restoration of the site in the event of a future closing or abandonment. Moreover, the board has the authority under Section 13 and 15 of the Waters Act to require security for the cost of reclamation. As to reclamation objectives, Section 13.1 provides the board with extremely broad discretion to include any license conditions it considers appropriate. And we recognize that under Chapter 14 of our and other final agreements, license conditions can't conflict with the term of a decision document, but the law is clear in TH's view that imposing additional or more stringent conditions does not result in a conflict, because you can comply with all terms by complying with the most stringent terms. And in this regard, we can look as a precedent to a license issued by the board in February in respect of a project that we'll mention in our written submissions, where the board reinserted as additional license conditions YESAB recommendations that were removed by YG in their decision document. And our written submissions will set out what specific conditions we would seek. Moving to the board's last question, what information should be required to support water license application? It's TH views that this question is driven by the questions that have just come before. You first determine what wetlands should be protected and what are open for development, and then you determine what wetland reclamation objectives are for wetlands that are open for development. And then and only then will you know what information should be provided by the applicants. And the board has heard a lot of good evidence over these last 3 days on information that should be required. And the presenters were largely aligned in our view, Mr. Chair, in the understanding that watershed level information, including mapping and baseline conditions and cumulative impacts, is a necessary piece of the puzzle. But where there was confusion, remaining confusion, is who should provide that information. And many board members have asked this question. In TH's view, it's helpful to recall what YG said in 2016 as their rationale, as the reason for rejecting YESAB's recommendation in the Northern Exposures Project that mining in undisturbed wetlands should be prohibited. YG's reason for varying this recommendation was, and this is a quote, information related to wetland functions and values cannot reasonably be provided on a project-by-project basis. YG then followed that with commitments in respect of mapping, developing baseline information to inform the proponent's wetland reclamation plan. So 4.5 years later, there shouldn't be any doubt that it's YG that should be providing information on a watershed level in respect of mapping baseline conditions and cumulative impacts. That's something that should absolutely be done in collaboration with other Yukon First Nations, such as its treaty partners. And there shouldn't be any doubt that this information is necessary to determine whether a license should be issued, and if so, to inform reclamation requirements. Without that information, again, licenses should not be issued. And with that, Mr. Chair, we'll just move to our last remarks, but before doing so, we want to say a quick word on the board's jurisdiction. We completely reject the views expressed yesterday on the limits of the board's jurisdiction, not just for the reasons the board has already raised, that the board has delegated authority in respect of Class 4 placer land use approvals, jurisdiction that expressly requires the board to consider adverse effects broadly, including environmental and socioeconomic effects and effects on treaty rights, but also on the basis of Chapter 14 of the final agreements and the Waters Act itself. There was a suggestion yesterday that the objects of the Waters Act are not relevant to the board's jurisdiction, and this is contrary to principles of statutory interpretation confirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada decades ago that expressly require legislation to be interpreted in light of its objects. And moreover, you can't ground jurisdiction by extracting out the definition of water from the rest of the Act and building an argument on that definition alone. The principles of statutory interpretation require legislation to be read in its entire context, and reading the Waters Act as a whole. There can be no doubt the board has jurisdiction in respect of activities in wetlands. And that's before we even consider Chapter 14 of TH and other Yukon First Nations final agreements. And I want to just pause here because it deserves emphasis. The issue of water was so important to TH and other Yukon First Nations that it warranted an entire chapter of their final agreements. As Chief Joseph said on Tuesday, water is life. Protecting water is protecting life. And so TH and other Yukon First Nations negotiated to ensure that a separate and independent body, this board, would regulate and protect water in accordance with the objectives of Chapter 14. It's been said repeatedly over the last 3 days. There's only one objective in Chapter 14, and that's to maintain the water of Yukon in a natural condition while providing for its sustainable use. And in the absence of conclusive determination that further activities will not irreversibly harm the functionality of a wetland complex, further mining in wetlands breaches that objective. TH gave up a significant amount to secure its final agreement. The objects of Chapter 14 and the protection of TH's rights under the final agreement are sacred, to use the Supreme Court of Canada's language. They're constitutionally protected and solemn obligations. And so TH calls on the board to take steps in line of its powers to ensure these objectives are met. And in the interest of time, Mr. Chair, TH will just reiterate the recommendations that we put forward on Tuesday night. Our presentations this week will be supported and supplemented by further written submissions to be filed on the deadline set by the board. And we again thank the board for their time. And we also want to recognize that our presentation ran late on Tuesday night and the board didn't have the opportunity to ask questions. And so we would invite the board, if they still wanted to set those out in a written matter so we can make sure that we can address any questions the board had arising from this week in our written submissions. Thank you.
We are waiting for the final commentary about the summary of the recommendations, or is that the final submission, Mr. Clark?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, that's it.
Oh, sorry. Okay. We're waiting for me, not for you. Thank you very much for the summary, and that brings us then to the Klondike Placer Miners Association. So I'll turn it over to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board. I'll begin with a few brief comments, primarily regarding the focus of this hearing, the process and outcomes, and then Brooke would also be making some comments as well. This public interest hearing was convened pursuant to Section 19, Sub 1 of the Waters Act. The scope of the hearing under that provision is clearly to consider matters relating to the conservation, development, and utilization of waters, in this case in wetlands. The KPMA participated on that basis. That is, on the understanding that the board is seeking feedback on the regulation of placer mining's use of water in the Yukon wetlands and the Water Board's associated powers to license such water use under the Waters Act. During the hearing, the board asked the KPMA for broader information, specifically an assessment of the board's powers under the final agreements and other Yukon legislation like the Placer Mining Act. The KPMA is considering whether to provide that information in its closing submissions, at least insofar as it's connected to this public hearing's legal objects. In this public hearing and in recent water licensing decisions, the Water Board determined it had jurisdiction over wetlands by equating wetlands to water without any further explanation or analysis. In other words, it determined it had jurisdiction over wetlands under the Waters Act. We say that is an error in the Water Board's assessment of its jurisdiction that is open to court challenge. Wetlands concern far more than water, as the last 3 days have shown. The board's duty under the Water Act is to focus on water quality and quantity. The KPMA asks that this jurisdictional error of equating wetlands to water not be repeated in future licensing proceedings. To briefly address the issue of the final agreements, the board's duty to assess water quality and quantity under the Waters Act is consistent with the threshold question that the board must consider under the final agreements when engaging in water licensing. And that question is, will the proposed use or deposit result in a substantial alteration of water quantity, quality, and rate of flow? If the answer is yes, then the board must engage with the First Nations constitutionally protected rights prescribed under the final agreements. Those rights differ in both strength and nature, depending on whether it concerns settlement lands or traditional territory. The KPMA is not intending to suggest that the Water Board should ignore the final agreements, which it agrees are constitutional documents. While the final agreements create limits on the water licensing process, which concerns First Nations rights, they do not create a blanket prohibition against water licensing or placer mining. It is also important to be clear that this hearing is not one convened to adjudicate a particular right under the Waters Act. This basic fact has broad significance, including with respect to what the Water Board may now do at the conclusion of this hearing process. With the broad array of information, argument, and opinions that have been presented over the last 3 days. The board's decision to structure a non-adversarial process with no right of cross-examination means that any information provided to the board in this public interest proceeding must now be treated with caution. The Water Board has the significant challenge of deciding what to do with a substantial body of information, argument, and opinion, which has not been tested in any way by the hearing participants. The board ought to proceed cautiously, particularly in formulating any decision, recommendation, or proposed guidelines that relies on information from this hearing. The Water Board also has not indicated to participants as of yet what it expects to do at the conclusion of this public hearing. In KPMA's submission, this hearing does not stand as an appropriate substitute for direct consultation with stakeholders, including placer miners, on any significant changes that the Water Board or the Yukon government will propose or seek to impose on the water license process. Again, the board must always be mindful it is a statutory body. It has a duty to uphold the rule of law and not exceed its statutory powers. In the KPMA submission, the Water Board has limited options for hearing outcomes. It is not adjudicating a specific right, and it certainly should not put forward recommendations on the basis of untested evidence that might impact an entire class of rights, like the existing rights of placer miners under the Placer Mining Act and the Waters Act. The board's stated goal of holding a non-adversarial public hearing, which will not impact anyone's existing or pending rights or interests, is also the reason why the KPMA did not raise an objection on the basis of reasonable apprehension of bias to the chair's hot mic comments on day 1 of the hearing. The KPMA appreciates the chair apologized for these words. The KPMA further welcomes the board's ongoing commitment to fairly adjudicating applications before it without predetermination of outcomes, and certainly without bias against anyone. Members of the placer industry have a long history in this territory, and they remain Yukon's version of the family farm. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having us again. We've heard a lot of negative opinions about placer mining in the last couple days of the proceeding. So this past season, my children and I visited over 65 mine sites, and I spoke with many more on the phone. And I think it's important to note that this mining industry is one that I'm comfortable bringing my young children to. I have 6-year-old twins. I've seen a lot of areas that are being discussed right now, and I know the people that are going to be affected by the Water Board's decisions in applying these guidelines to applications. The statistics that I did gather this season from the 2020 field work tells us some strong things. Over 90% of placer miners are families. The average operation is second generation. 50% of placer mines are owned or co-owned by women. 40% of placer miners live in the Yukon year-round, and upwards of 80% live and pay taxes in the Yukon for at least 7 months a year. Our industry will inject an estimated $118 million into the Yukon economy, starting with the communities. Excluding government, placer mining will contribute 6.5% of the territorial GDP. Miners go where there is gold. The Indian River Valley is known as a gold deposit that has been mined both historically with passive reclamation practices and more recently under the new regime and newer reclamation practices employed, reaching a higher level of compliance with modern regulations. The Indian River drainage has less than 2% of the disturbance out of the total TH territory wetlands, which is estimated at 10% through the recent resource assessment report. Due to the increased landscape diversity from placer work over the last 120 years, the Indian River drainage is known to have high moose densities compared to surrounding areas and significantly high populations of other animals like lynx, rabbits, and beavers. And I saw a lot of them this summer. The Department of Environment provided us with the rapid wetland assessment of known planning region cover areas under Dawson, Ross River, Peel, North Yukon, and recently Beaver River area. And of these broadly mapped locations, 58.6% is shown as having wetland cover. Only 0.5% of the entire territory is covered with placer claims. That is not disturbance, it's placer claims, so just a small fraction of that is actually disturbed land. In the Dawson Regional Planning Area alone, at least 10% of the land is covered by wetlands, and only 4% are covered by claims. Again, placer disturbance is not equal to claims, so it's a fraction of that 4%. It's just the only metric that I was able to find. So in noting this small footprint, we are not suggesting that land use planning is irrelevant. To the contrary, we think that land use planning is an important part of the process, and I'm personally actively involved in participating with those proceedings. To be clear, we are also agreeing that the Yukon Water Board must be respectful of the constitutional rights enshrined in the final agreements. We also appreciate and respect the testimonies and opinions of the First Nation citizens that have spoken over the past 2 days. This hearing has given us 3 questions to respond to, and we are doing our best to both work within the scope of the hearing and work to maintain the health of our industry, which is deeply connected to the Yukon, our history, and our current economy, and our people. We'd like to correlate the economic and physical impacts of the placer industry with this example. An industry that employs around 500 people will contribute 6.5% of the GDP and put $118 million into the economy while covering staked a small fraction of 0.5% of the territory's land. Placer mining is chemically stable. In other words, water quality, quantity, and flow are maintained. Many of our members, their drinking water comes directly from tailings ponds. We heard yesterday that there are some concerns over water quality, and my personal experience is that the only sediments in tailings ponds are in situ silt and dirt materials. And I know several miners whose drinking water comes directly from their tailings ponds. And I certainly enjoy swimming and using them. The BMPs the best management practices for reclamation and wetlands that the KPMA has created a few years ago, which you heard from the Chamber of Mines about yesterday, are reasonable, implementable when used, and mitigate the water quality, quantity, and flow risks. As Mr. Smith said on the first day, biodiversity is largely a function of landscape diversity. And as Mr. Kenyon said yesterday, that the placer mined shallow water wetlands and ponds have higher benefits than what was there before. If we look at what placer miners can easily do in their mining process, and that is create both shallow water and marshy wetlands, as well as uplands like contoured hills and slopes that enhance landscape diversity, in doing so, we will be increasing biodiversity. In terms of assessing water quality, quantity, and flow, placer miners are already obliged to complete the DFO worksheets as part of their licensing application and are inspected to provide, inspected to provide reports to DFO to ensure compliance. In the 2019 report from Compliance Monitoring and Inspections, the average effluent concentration from samples collected throughout the watersheds were, quote, well below the current compliance standards and the standards that would be phased in, as well as well below the action levels for these standards. I think it's clear to say that placer miners are meeting their water quality objectives. Yesterday, I said that rather than making it harder for mines to operate, the process guidance should be making it easier for mines to operate responsibly and sustainably. Making a water license application harder does not improve compliance, make a better miner, save a wetland, encourage reclamation practices, or enforce regulations that exist. Adopting and working collaboratively on finessing the existing best management practices to create an enforceable reclamation structure that is adaptive and responsive to a case-by-case operation could ensure that positive change and protection when needed can occur on the ground and not be determined in the initial application phase alone. To speak for a moment about the guidelines, setting aside who has the authority to require this information, we know wetlands provide important functions and benefits. The KPMA is not opposed to providing wetland information to inform decision-making, but we're opposed to how and when this information is collected, and we hope to be brought to the table when that is determined. Instead of a large document that duplicates much of the information already gathered earlier on in the YESA application process, wetland data requirements and methods for collecting data should be laid out in easy-to-use worksheets similar to the DFO and fish habitat management worksheets developed in collaboration with Yukon government, Indigenous government, federal government, industry, and conservation groups. A risk-based approach could be used to inform placer miners on the potential costs of permitting and reclamation of wetlands. The KPMA is looking forward to working collaboratively with all groups to further develop best management practices for reclamation, starting with the ones we know exist and can work when utilized. So we'll just finish with our response to the 3 questions again. So what information should be required to support a water license application related to placer mining activities in wetlands? Looking at the Waters Act, in considering a water license application for the board should focus on information relevant to assessing the impact of the use of water or the deposit of waste in water on water quality, quantity, or flow. The water board also ought to provide guidance on how it will assess the information provided to it when deciding a license application. In assessing water license applications located in wetlands, the board already has substantial information available to it as part of the current application processes. Again, we recognize that if the board concludes there is substantial alteration of water quality, quantity, or flow, then First Nations rights under the final agreements must also be considered. Those rights do not create a blanket prohibition against licensing the use of water for placer mining in the Yukon. The question number 2, what should the wetland conservation, development, and utilization objectives be for watershed, and how can they be balanced on an application by application basis? Determining wetland objectives is not a decision the water board should be making. The water board's jurisdiction is water, not wetlands, and decisions concerning whether the mining should be permitted in wetlands is primarily a land use decision. This question is better left to be answered in the context of a wetland policy development process that is currently being undertaken by the Yukon government. It will also no doubt be part of the discussion in land use planning. And the 3rd question, what reclamation objectives should be considered during the water licensing process? For placer mining, reclamation is primarily the jurisdiction of EMR as noted in a Yukon Water Board briefing note earlier this year. We recommend the adoption of the current best management practices to make their use part of ongoing mining process, and we think that would likely achieve effective reclamation practices as suggested by TH in the previous presentation. Finally, the KPMA is open to discussing new ideas and solutions in a collaborative manner. We must be able to work together to achieve a balance in placer mining and wetlands. Our door is open and we look forward to working with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rudolph, and thank you both for your presentation. This brings us to the to our lunch break, and we will take the expected 90 minutes for lunch and reconvene at 1 o'clock. So that's just 10 minutes short of the draft agenda. So if we could hear from Ducks Unlimited at that point, that would be great. So we will adjourn until 1 o'clock. Thank you.